Welcome back to A Complete History of Manchester United. I'm your host, Wayne Barton, author and producer of several Manchester United books and films, and I will be joined as always by the legendary football writer Patrick Barclay to take you on this journey through Old Trafford history. If you are watching the video, please give it a like and subscribe. Join in the conversation in the comment section. And if you're listening to the audio podcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a review on the platform that you are listening on. Well, this is one hell of a busy season today, Paddy. In the last episode, we took in the title-winning campaign of 1951-52, and this season there's no trophies, but it's possibly the most drastic overall of a championship-winning team you're ever likely to see in British football. 7 young players giving debuts throughout the course of the season, and another one signed in, a big-name player signed later on in the season. 12-game tour, though, as we intimated in the last episode, the 12-game post-season tour. After winning the title, they went back to North America. And this, you said the last one was eventful. This one includes near riots in games against Atlas Club of Mexico in Los Angeles. There are 2 games against them. Things were so bad in the first one, and apparently we should go on record as saying there's no indication that any United players or any of the United party were to blame for the near riots that were reported in the first game. Busby had wanted to call the second game off. It wasn't called off. United played the game. They won 4-3. It was described by many as, many journalists who were watching it on that side of the country in North America as the finest game of soccer ever seen on the Pacific coast. But Paddy, that's not quite how it was reported back home. And as the tour went on, it got quite fruity for United.
Yes, it did. I mean, after the first game, Busby, as you rightly say, was concerned that this was not the tranquil, entertaining, hands across the sea visit to America. It was a rough house, and so Busby went to his captain Carey and said, tell the boys they must not retaliate. Sure enough, Roger BYRNE, who we mentioned in the last episode, who'd forced his way into the team and played a crucial part as an outside left in the title-winning team of 51-52. Roger, by now yearning to play at left back, but he was kicked and retaliated and was sent off. And Busby was furious, went to BYRNE and said, listen, you were told you either apologize to Johnny Carey within 2 hours or you're going home. And this had echoes, of course, of of Busby's iron fist that he'd applied to Johnny Morris and Charlie Mitten from the 48 cup-winning team. And although by now he could clearly see a big future for Roger BYRNE, the same rule was applied. So anyway, suffice it to say that BYRNE was a strong character, as we said last week, grammar school boy, bright, independent-minded, but this was too much. So he'd been given 2 hours to go to Carey. Within 15 minutes, he knocked on Carey's door and said, listen, I'm really sorry. That became known to the rest of the squad. And so it was clear that Roger BYRNE this wasn't to be the end of the tensions between BYRNE and Busby, because BYRNE believed he was a left back. He was being used most of the time at outside left. And as I say, United had the first title in 30 seasons because of it, partly because of it. So there were tensions remaining, but Busby, once again, as with Mitten and Morris, had made his point. And the tour went on.
Yeah, and as it got towards the end of it, Paddy, there was a little bit of discontent in the entire squad because of the financial recompense.
It wouldn't be Busby era Manchester United if there wasn't financial tension. the club had a culture of penny pinching, which was, in a way, a creation of its environment. I mean, it had to, in modern times, we got used to talking about the difficulties of clubs, even, big clubs like Arsenal, Tottenham, who rebuild stadiums and having to, the tension between the money for the rebuilding and the thing. Well, of course, and the team. Well, of course, Manchester United, way back in the post Second World War period, were in that position. They had to rebuild the ground after the bombing. Yes, they were given compensation, but that had been an expensive business. So that it was quite natural that there should be the Secretary Walter Crickmer, Matt Busby, other staff should be brought up in a culture of taking care of the pennies. And yes, as in the tour of 2 years earlier, the players felt they should have been given more spending money. And given that they were mixing at times with world stars of the entertainment world, such as Bob Hope, Bing Crosby. Bob Hope, by the way, born in England. One of his favorite lines was, I was born in England of a family of, I think, I had six brothers. That's how I learned to dance, waiting to use the toilet. Anyway, they met Bob Hope, the great comedian. They met Bing Crosby, and Jerry Lewis. The biggest stars in the world. That's what was one of the benefits. If playing against Atlas was one of the penances of going out to Los Angeles, one of the benefits was in being able to go back to Hollywood, meet the stars.
Yeah, it always reminds me of a great line from Tommy Doherty, who of course we'll talk about later in this series. But a lot of that tension came from the fact that the players were paid more in the season than they were in the summer. So even though they were going on this 12-game tour, they were still full-time footballers through the summer.
Yeah.
They were paid possibly around 30% less. And Tommy would always say that, that it was always proportional with the contract as well. So the top players would be paid a little bit more than squad players, even in the summer. And Doherty had complained, saying that he was as good as anyone on his day off.
Yeah,
to be paid as much as anyone when they're not playing, and he had a point. But yeah, that was like Paddy said, indicative of the financial situation at the club.
Yeah,
there'll be a few more stories like that along the way. The squad.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Tommy Doherty was one of the players that there's a story told about various people, saying but of course you get less, in the summer because, of course Vinny gets more because he's a better player than you. And whoever it was, either Tommy Doherty, said not in the summer he isn't.
Yeah.
But he probably was because he was playing for England. But those were days, it's difficult for people nowadays to realize that although footballers were paid more than the average worker, especially, even the average working man, I could bear in mind that men were paid more than women still at that time, generally speaking. That they weren't super rich, they weren't as they are now. The kind of salaries that are paid at Manchester United, for a week, these players wouldn't earn in a year, in a lifetime, or anything like.
Yeah, indeed, and we'll actually come to one example of that later in this podcast with one of the players who gets introduced into the team this season. The squad was by now getting populated with the younger players that they were developing at the club, and we will be touching on how quickly those players were developing. United's nationwide scouting and that local approach that they had to finding landladies and landlords resulted in this sort of situation being typical now, where in Mrs. Watson's house, for example, on Birch Avenue in Stretford, it housed Johnny Berry, Jackie Flower, Mark Jones, and three new youngsters who'd come in. David Pegg, from the previous season, he'd been signed as a junior player and was doing great things in the reserve team, partly helped by Roger Burns' development because Pegg now got in the reserves. But two new lads came along, and we'll be talking about one of them in this episode. Gordon Clayton and Duncan Edwards are coming from the Midlands. So you imagine all those players in one house. And it was funny because the club, even up to the 70s, would advertise in newspapers in the programme for new landladies and landlords. So, the vetting was fairly liberal, to be fair. They probably had Armstrong going around. He most undoubtedly did. It went around every one of these households to see that these people were fitted to look after them. But as we would find out through later episodes of this podcast, Mrs. Watson's house turned into something of ill repute. There's like 5 or 6 players there, and even more came over the time as well, which is just incredible when you think about it. But it was part of this idea of fostering good team spirit, which was actually working really well at junior level, not so far at the first team level. We talk about that then, Paddy, 'cause the title defence was quite horrific, really. Alarm bells were ringing in early October. There was a game against Wolves at Molineux where they were 2-0 up and they absolutely collapsed. They'd be 2-0 up in 20 minutes and then half time it's 2-2. They lose 6-2. And you had senior players like Aston, Carey, Chilton, Pearson, Rowley, and all of a sudden it was looking like those players were over the hill.
That's right. This is, known in shorthand terms, Busby built 3 great teams. And this was still, and we're now talking season 52-3, this was still what is known, as I say, in shorthand terms, as the 48 team. Still 5 or 6 of them, if you'd include John Aston, whose position at left back, Roger BYRNE very much had his eye on already, because Roger BYRNE was older than most of the young players. A late developer, but if you include Aston, that would be 6 really from the 48 team, still just about hanging on. But this is to be Carey's last season. He's now 36, coming up to 36. The others would be Pearson, who was destined to take over for him as captain. Henry Coburn still there, but this season, you mentioned the number of young players, the phenomenal number of young players, and some of them, at least 3 of them, only 17 pitched into the team. This season was definitely, although on the face of it, not a particularly impressive title defence. It was the beginning of Busby's next great team, which was destined to be known as the 58 team. So, yes, some tremendous players coming through, not just local boys. Eddie Coleman's already come through, and is playing in the youth team. But from further afield, you may remember that during the late James Gibson's chairmanship, he when he hired Busby, he wanted a Manchester team made of Manchester and district players. That had gone by the board. Louis Rocca, his coach, had now also died, and Joe Armstrong was very much the face of Manchester United's recruitment, and that went far and wide. You mentioned Duncan Edwards, who was from Dudley in the Black Country, but already at the club and doing well in the youth ranks and actually making his debut in this season is Jackie Blancheflower, brother of Danny, and a super player who we touched on the last episode. And later in this season, Joe Armstrong's travels take him up to the northeast, where his eyes are very firmly fixed on a boy called Bobby Charlton.
Yeah, it's incredible, really. That the last hurrah of that 48 side is technically the Charity Shield. The Charity Shield in those days played in the autumn, either in September or October. At the home of the champions, which were United, and they took on Newcastle and they won. The last trophy, and it was treated somewhat seriously then. It's a occasion. United won the game. Like I said in one of the previous episodes where we talked about the Charity Shield, the actual rules of the game in terms of substitutes and everything weren't hard and fast, and that again will be something that comes across later in the decade. But it was still nonetheless a trophy that the players took seriously, and they counted it as a trophy. So United were happy to win that. But
no League Cup, of course. No League Cup in those days. So I suppose that made the Charity Shield more of a pull.
Yeah, and it, it effectively served as a Super Cup.
Yes.
Because it was the league champions against the FA Cup winners. So it was a bit of a showpiece occasion, even if it would be sort of reduced to the midweek and in an autumn game. It was still fairly serious. But that was the last hurrah. Then you've got 2 weeks after the Newcastle game in the Charity Shield is when they lose against Wolves, and then a couple of games after that, a 2-0 home defeat to Stoke. Leeds United 21st in the table. Unreal. United then, Busby has made the decision really. He's starting to introduce the kids. On a more widespread scale, there'd be some definitive games in later seasons where you would say this is where a big change was made. But certainly at the time, he was gradually introducing these players, and the best run of form came as they introduced all these kids into the side. David Pegg was getting a little run, and he looked really good in partnership with Roger Byrne down that whole left-hand side. Like I said, Byrne had got his wish, moving at left back, and Pegg was absolutely...
He had, after, sorry to interject, but after asking for a transfer, and he had to be the wise old head. This is probably one of Carey's last great contributions as captain, was to put his arm round Roger Byrne and say, wait, your chance will come. And sure enough, within a matter of weeks and, well, months at the most, Roger Byrne has got his wish to play left back. Busby, of course, very quietly acceding to his wishes and slipping him in as and when Busby decided. And by Christmas, they'd gone up from 21st, second bottom, to 9th.
Yeah, where Mitten and Aston had sort of craft and guile, there was a relentless amount of speed in Byrne and Pegg, and you imagine two players of that speed coming at you all the time. It was the right-hand side of defences was not having an easy time against United. Eddie Lewis, the brash youngster who'd stolen Reg Allen's Brill Cream in the previous episode, he was now in the team at number 9 and scoring goals as a 17-year-old. As we'll come to the figures later on, he had a prolific run in the side, but Busby's concern was that he was 17 and they cannot be relying on him. That'll be the introduction of a new player who comes in, Tommy Taylor, and we'll talk about Tommy a little bit later on.
Yes, Pegg was only 17 as well. 4 17-year-olds during the season, not to mention 2 18-year-olds, a lad called Johnny Scott, who I don't know very much about, but and of course the local boy Dennis Violet, who we were to hear an awful lot about. But if you're talking about Violet, you're talking about class, true class. And Tommy Taylor, when we get on to Tommy, that there was a real quality player, and one who, although his England career was destined to be curtailed, will still to this day, if you talk about great England goal scorers, you have to include Tommy Taylor in that.
Yeah, Lewis and Taylor were coming in basically as long-term replacements for Rowley, and the goal scoring features, we'll come to the stats a little bit later, is incredible. Lewis scores a bunch of goals, and then Taylor comes in and immediately settles to life at Old Trafford, scoring a bunch of goals. I think, ironically enough, as Busby tries to sort of give the old guard a little bit of maybe it's a farewell, maybe it's a reintroduction to the side, just to give them one last chance to see if they are actually past it. The form dips at the end of the season. United finishing 8th overall, which is a bit of an alarming slump from first, Paddy. I mean, even accounting for the transition, you would say that it's a poor season.
I think only with the benefit of hindsight could you not be alarmed. I'm sure, the sporting pink, if it had already turned pink, I think it had, in Manchester, the letters page, the legendary letters page I haven't actually checked, but I'd be very surprised if there wasn't a certain amount of consternation. You remember before there was a lot of worry that the kids Busby was blooding were not quite of the required standard. Well, there's no question that the ones he had now were to be proved above the right standard. I mean, fantastic. They were sixth actually, United, when when they went into the last game, but they was hammered 5-0 at Middlesbrough, and that consigned them to eighth position. There have been worse title defences since, but and of course in those days the league was more mercurial. You didn't have these sort of winning 3 in a row as during the Ferguson era. Not just at United, but I think Liverpool must have done that a couple of times before. So that sort of, these dynasties, this sort of set in stone superiority didn't really. Yes, Portsmouth, I think, had won it twice in a row, and maybe Wolves, but you did tend to find that teams were up 1 minute, down the next. It was a better competitive balance in English football in those days than there is now.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, Busby had probably braced himself for the fact that there would be a bit of a drop.
Yes.
They were traditionally finishing second. I think he
Very much
expected
so.
that you were going to get a little bit of a dip when he was bringing these players in. And no one within Old Trafford was panicking at all. They were, they knew it was part of the process. We'll talk about now. Let's just bring in the youth team a little bit here. So the title defence did see United finish 8th, which was their lowest post-war showing, but and they also were eliminated in the FA Cup by Everton in the 5th round as well. So it was another disappointing showing there. But the FA Youth Cup was another matter completely. Now, this was a competition that was created to give young players a chance to compete against each other. The brainchild of Joe Richards. At the end of the Second World War, the FA had organised a youth championship for county associations because they thought that was the best way to get players, youngsters of that age, competitive against each other. Those matches didn't really get a lot of interest, but the idea got a lot of interest because people started thinking, well, you could apply that to clubs instead of counties. And obviously that's where the genesis of this Youth Cup idea came in. It was introduced in the 52-53 season, which it's almost, if you would have asked Busby and Murphy to design a competition that best showcased the talent, it would be something like this, really. And so the players were given this platform. United come against some of the top teams in the country in this season, and some who not so top. The first team they faced in the Youth Cup was Leeds. Another of those trivia questions: which Charlton was the first goal scorer for Manchester United? Well, it was Jack Charlton because he scored an own goal in a 4-0 win for United at Old Trafford. And then Nantwich 23-0. Nantwich Town, they come to they were drawn at home, but they couldn't play at home, so they played at the Cliff, I think. And they arrived at Old Trafford and they had to wear the visiting uniform, which was like this high vis, because they didn't have their own kit, or I think the kit was too dark for the night. So they switched into this high visibility training gear, which looked horrible, but it was United's training gear, and they basically looked like a training match because they were 10-0 down at half time. You would have thought that Jimmy Murphy would have been happy with that, but he absolutely hammered the players at half time, drilling it into them that they've got to keep going and they've got to keep taking the game seriously, which they do. They win 23-0, which is obviously still a competition record, but it was a massive statement victory. That it was like this United group of youngsters were going to be relentless and they were going to keep going here. They weren't going to stop, and they did kept going throughout the competition. They won Bury, they won against Everton, defeated Barnsley, they defeated Brentford, and they come up against Wolves. And we talked about how they were not imitating. I think that's probably a little bit unkind from me, but they were certainly following that path of developing their own young players. And this was seen as a sort of cream tie of the competition, basically. And everyone was quite happy that it was United against Wolves. And in the first leg, I mean, I'm just going to read through the team that played that first leg. And some of these names will be familiar, some of them won't be. Clayton, Fulton, Kennedy, Coleman, Cope, Edwards, McFarlane, Whelan, Lewis, Pegg, Scanlon, and you will appreciate that some of those have already played in the first team. They won against Wolves 7-1.
Well, it's extraordinary how many of the names you've just read out were to become part of the great 1958 team or thereabouts. Also, on our picture there, which is of the team who reached the last 16. In that, Ronnie Cope, who was pretty close to the first team, was to be pretty close to the first team 5 years later. I mean, normally you look at youth teams and you'll get one or two. Forget about the class of 92 here, but by and large, you go any club in the country, if they produce a couple of top first team players, it's a great generation. But if you look at this lot and you look forward to the 58, to the next Busby's next great team, you look at in the photograph alone, there's David Pegg, a fantastic player, winger. Gordon Clayton, by the way, came up with Duncan Edwards on the same train. Was a goalkeeper, but didn't quite have that quality. Duncan Edwards, arguably the greatest player ever to play for Manchester United. Albert Scanlon, who really, he and Pegg were two of the best left wingers in the country. They're both at Manchester United. Then you've got John Doherty, who would have been almost certainly would have been a top player, but for persistent knee injuries. And Eddie Lewis, you mentioned earlier. But out of all of those, if you look at Bryce Fulton, who is a Scotsman, who's on our right of Gordon Clayton, the goalkeeper, he was the only one that didn't really make a big future in the game, make a decent living in the game, should I say? And several of them became, including Edwards and Scanlon and Coleman and so on, became United legends. Pegg.
The Youth Cup victory had this knock-on effect where, just like the FA Cup in 1948, where some of these players that you see in the picture, Edwards, again, this is for the video watchers, not the audio listeners, but you've got the likes of Edwards, and we'll come to him in a moment as we go through the squad. But a lot of these players were influenced by the 48 final, and now the young players were seeing how good the United youth team were. You had Wilf McGuinness, who was present at the Youth Cup final against Wolves, and he was coveted by every top club in the country. And because of the size of their win, he was like, okay, I'll go and sign for United, which he did. And you mentioned Bobby Charlton, he was another one who was enticed because of that reputation. So it was having this snowball effect, really. And as we'll come, you mentioned there, Paddy, you mentioned 10 players and only Bryce Fulton not making a career in the game. It's phenomenal. I guess it'll be part of the process for the next 4 or 5 episodes, where we look through these Youth Cup teams and look at the sheer number of top players that the club are developing. And we talked about it being unparalleled in the country or in the game, really, since this period. I think.
Yeah, but they were all trying it. Wolves were trying it, and United won 9-3 on aggregate in the final of the FA Youth Cup. Just suppose Wolves had got Duncan Edwards instead of United. I don't think it would have been 9-3, would it? And of course, he was right on the doorstep of Wolves. He was plucked. He signed for Manchester United at 2 a.m. because Manchester United feared at the beginning of this season that he was going to sign for Wolves. So, of course, when Wolves got to the final, they went there with a burning sense of injustice. Stan Cullis, the manager, a friend of Busby's, took charge of the team. Jimmy Murphy, was in charge of the United team, this team you can see here. Also, another friend of Matt Busby's, Bill Ridding, who's manager of Bolton Wanderers. They were scooping up they were fighting for the cream of England's schoolboy team, in which Busby was there. They used Ray Parry, the previous captain of the England schoolboys, to try and entice Edwards to Bolton rather than Man United. But it is a thought that if you take
Duncan Edwards out of the United team in that final and put him in the Wolves team. Might have made a big difference to the score.
Yeah, Cullis, like we said, he was doing the things that Busby was doing, or was at least taking heed of that.
Yeah. By now, this was the Busby way was recognised as the way.
Yeah. Yeah, United had actually been invited to the Blue Star tournament that summer, but they'd already arranged a youth tour to Ireland, so they had to decline the invitation, which Wolves accepted, and they went in United's place. Now, the Blue Star was an international youth tournament held in Zurich. The idea, like the FA Youth Cup, was to invite the best teams in the world, but obviously, being based in Zurich, they had to include a few local teams as well. United's first participation in that would be the following season. But yeah, they ended the season like a Youth Cup winner. So definitely, and we could say as well that was because it was the first iteration of that competition. It was the first time it had been held. No one's ever going to say it was a major trophy, but there was a significant interest in what United had done in that.
Well, the crowd at Old Trafford for the first leg was 21,000, and that must have gladdened Busby's heart because he wanted, these young players to feel that, to understand the atmosphere of being stars, to prepare them for the, for the pressures of the first team. And it's just interesting, if before we leave the Youth Cup, that I missed out from the list of players who played in the final who were destined for true distinction. Billy Whelan, Billy or Liam Whelan, depending on whether you took the Mancunian or the Dublin habit. But he was the most modest boy, and he came over and he signed, and that was a significant signing because he was a fantastic player and inside right attacking midfield player, and was to score goals on a sort of Stan Pearson scale for Manchester United during a career that was unfortunately curtailed too early.
Yeah, Whelan, obviously a player who will be featuring on this podcast many times in the future. Let's run through the squad as we usually do, starting off with the goalkeepers. The senior goalkeeper this season, Reg Allen, had injury problems, so he was reduced to just 2 appearances. And the senior goalkeeper was Jack Crompton, who made 25 appearances, but this was really at the back end of his career, and I think he was called in a bit of an emergency, really. And Ray Wood effectively ended the season's first choice with 17 appearances in all competitions. Allen and Oliver, we'll get to in a moment, making 2 appearances each. These were only 2 appearances for the club.
Incredible. What a story.
It is. I'll tell a little bit of it, Paddy, and I'm sure you'll be able to fill in some gaps. So he was a Salford lad. He joined the club as a promising young player. He was also an administrative assistant, and he was equally adept behind a desk, and he didn't know what he wanted to do with his career. So he was helping out with the administration at Old Trafford.
That's right.
Well, as being not only a goalkeeper, but sometimes a left back, sometimes a midfielder. He was like a Johnny fix the problem. Wherever United needed someone at any given time, he'd just be there. And I'm sure United had plenty of players to fill the gaps, but he just loved United so much that he would just turn up and, like I said, there's a great story that comes from this season. Like 2 weeks after he made his debut, alongside Dennis Viollet at Newcastle in April 1953. A couple of weeks after that, he played in the left back position in the A team. So it tells you everything about his multi-versatility in a way that few other players had in United history. And I want to give some context in Les Olive's own words here. He said, after the war, United were playing their first home games at Main Road because Old Trafford had been bombed. That meant both clubs' reserves played at our ground, and it was my job to open the turnstiles, pay the referees, and so on. When we went back to Old Trafford in '49, the consequent return of the senior administrative staff left me with a lighter burden, which gave me time for training. Before long, I was playing in the A and B sides, occasionally for the reserves, occupying every position except outside left, with my favourite spots being full-back or centre-half. It's just extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, yes, and considering he was also working alongside, working as deputy to Walter Crickmer in the secretary's office.
It was an extra. I mean, he's an extraordinary contributor to Manchester United, and many years. And bear in mind, but those 2 games he played in goal, which were against away to Newcastle and home to West Bromwich, and he bowed out of those 2 games with an unbeaten record. They won one and drew the other. So he didn't let the side down, playing in goal. He was actually, it's not, I'm not quite sure, but I think he might have even been preferred to Jack Crompton on that occasion. Wood and Allen were unavailable. But Jack Crompton, his goalkeeping had been called into question at that stage of the season. But many, many years later, in the 1970s, when I turned up reporting at Old Trafford and other places, Les Olive was very much the board's right-hand man. He was the club secretary and what would now be called chief executive. And he was always there, resplendent. That's a lovely picture of him in his blazer. He even when I got there in the 70s, he looked smart in his blazer, and he wasn't sort of overweight or anything like that. You could believe he'd been an ex-player, but an absolutely United daft he was, and he very much knew his place. He was a very modest man, and probably undervalued, although after his death, and in more recent years, partly through excellent podcasts like yours, Wayne, he has become his role in the history of Manchester United has become more properly recognised.
Unreal, really. You asked me, I mean, obviously I'm United mad, but my dream was to write when I was growing up, and be involved in writing. If you give me a career, Les Olive played 10 positions for United, played for the first team. He just made it up as he went along, and then was involved in administration for the club for his entire life. I'd be tempted to take that career. It was pretty special.
Yes, very good point. Yeah, and what a book. What a book he could have written, and but of course he wouldn't, because he wasn't a whistle blower, if you see what I mean. He wasn't a
once you get behind the curtain,
he wasn't a trumpet blower either. He was the interests of Manchester United would be way above.
Yeah. So that's a gentleman who made 2 appearances. Another one who made 2 appearances this season was Bill Foulkes, but he went on to make 688 appearances for the club.
Yeah.
Of course, a very different career. St Helens lad from Liston Boys Club, full-back.
Was he still working as a minor at this stage?
He was indeed. This is what I was going to come on to say. This is what I was talking about, these supplementary jobs that players had. I mean, he's a full-back at this stage as well, so he wasn't quite ready to play centre off, even though you could see his broad shoulders, and he's a big lad as well. Busby and Murphy always felt his long-term position would be in the middle, but there was so much competition at this stage that Foulkes himself felt intimidated and thinking he wasn't good enough. He kept his job working part-time down the coal mine. So yeah, he made just 2 appearances this season, local lad. He loved United, but he just wasn't. He didn't have the confidence. And I mean, one of the features of Busby and Murphy's work at United that will come clear as this podcast goes on, is not just in the introduction of players; it's the patience that they showed with them. And Bill Foulkes, considering he goes on to play nearly 700 appearances for the club, and he takes almost a full season out at one point. It's just extraordinary, really. 2 appearances this season, as he's one of this magnificent 7 who are making the breakthrough into that side. So he plays at fullback, deputising for the likes of Roger Byrne, who played 40 appearances in the league, 45 in all competitions, and 4 goals. John Aston still made a heavy number of appearances, 45 in all, scoring 8 goals, 40 in the league. Johnny Carey, now mostly playing at right half, 37 appearances in all competitions, 32 in the league, and a single goal. Mark Jones, who we mentioned in the previous episode, he makes 2 appearances this season. Tom McNulty, the regular right back, he makes 23 appearances and 24 in all competitions. The other fullback competition comes from Billy Redman. 1 game at left back. United are well stocked there now, and Billy Redman's career is on the wane, unfortunately, after obviously putting in an admirable stint as well. So if we get into this half-back line, you mentioned Jackie Blanchflower earlier on. He makes 1 appearance this season. He did have an injury at the back end of the previous season where he needed an operation, so he was obviously needing some recuperation time as well. He made 1 appearance in the half-back line. Allenby Chilton still makes 42 appearances. He played every single game for the club this season, 47, so he's still showing some durability. Not one of those that Busby's too concerned about just yet, but with the emergence of one player we're about to mention, his squad place is really at risk. Henry Coburn, 26 appearances in all competitions, just 22 in the league. Don Gibson, as we mentioned in previous episodes, 20 appearances in the league, 21 in all competitions. And Jeff Whitefoot now making a bigger stake for first-team place, 10 appearances in the league and in all competitions. And that brings us on to Duncan Edwards, a really big name in this generation. One of a generation, certainly by himself, but of this young lad, these young lads who had listened, as I said earlier, to the 48 final on the radio. The 3 goals that came in that short burst of time gave them such an imagination. These were the lads who just ran out and started playing football on the field after dreaming of playing for United. Now, he was, as you mentioned, coveted heavily by many clubs, most notably Bolton and Wolves, who both thought that they had him at one point. Managers had him in the car. He was having to refuse them to the face.
That's right.
But United were able to acquire this lad of 5'10", built like an oak, having names like Bomber already at the age of 16. He made 1 appearance this season against Cardiff. He was 16, setting a new appearance record for a young player. He was actually tipped off to United. You mentioned an Everton player who Busby was after. Is a lad called Alec Farrell.
Yeah.
And Busby really wanted him, but he wanted to go to Everton. And when Busby was complaining about this to Joe Mercer, he'd been on a coaching course in Blackpool, and he'd seen
he knew the England schoolboys,
and he'd seen Farrell. He saw Duncan Edwards. And he said, "Don't be worried about Farrell. Go and get Duncan Edwards." I'm going to read a couple of quotes here about Edwards as well. George Follows, in his News Chronicle column of April 1st, which was just before Edwards made his debut, and this is a great line, which talks about the speaks volumes for the sports writing of this generation. Like the father of the first atom bomb, Manchester United are waiting for something tremendous to happen. This tremendous football force they've discovered is Duncan Edwards, who is exactly 16 and a half this morning. Edwards' his most notable contribution this season had been in the game against Everton in the Youth Cup. We spoke about how Nantwich Town had been put to the sword by 23 goals. Well, Edwards was moved to centre forward to play against Everton, and this was a quite common occurrence when even a talented youth side like United was struggling. They just move Edwards from half back to centre forward, and he'd score a goal and then move back. It was like what you see on a playground, basically, when you move the best player forward just to win the game. And that has to speak volumes for how good Edwards was in a sea of talented players, that he was able to make that kind of difference. I will give you Matt Busby's first impression of him from the first day of training. Obviously, Busby had seen him play before, but Busby saw every player play, so it was waiting for that striking first impression, really. This is a line, I think it's from his My Story book. He says, "At the start of the season, Jimmy Murphy, Bert Wally and I get the boys together for an informal chat in which I tell them, we 3 are here to help you in every way possible. If you have any problems, bring them to us and tell us all about them. We don't want you to brood about anything, because if you do, your football is going to suffer. Those of you with ground staff jobs, make sure you report for duty in good time. We want you to enjoy yourselves, but this is not a holiday camp." Following one such talk, I pulled Jimmy Murphy to one side and said, "Jimmy, you see the big boy in the corner of the room? All the time I've been talking, his eyes have been on me, taking everything in. That is the way he has been ever since, always ready to listen to something that may be to his benefit. The boy's name, Duncan Edwards." Edwards was setting a standard, basically, Paddy, where because he was so good, and he was so dedicated to self-improvement in a way that people might say of Cristiano Ronaldo these days. They saw a player who was already at the top, like he was already recognised as the best around, but he was so dedicated to self-improvement. They add this incredible motivational aspects on the rest of the squad as well.
But listen to the authority of that quote from that you so wisely gave us from George Follows, the journalist. He must have known to know that it was the the footballing equivalent of the atom. I mean, George must have been, that it tells you about the relationships between trusted journalists, and nowadays no journalist would be given that kind of an insight by the manager and staff of a club. George just happened to be able to write it better than most, but they were to be proved so right.
We'll go on to forward line now, and no less than six players got given chances to make their impression in this season. So we'll go through them. I'll go through them in alphabetical order to make it easier. Johnny Berry, who'd obviously nailed down that right-hand side position. He was predominant in this area. 40 appearances, 7 goals.
Yeah.
45 appearances in all competitions. Ernie Bond, we spoke about in previous episodes, makes 1 appearance. I think this is it for him, really. Like we've talked about PEGG, we've talked about BYRNE, all these players coming in. Bond's time is running out. Frank Clemson, additionally, 4 appearances in the league. But he's also going to fail. Not fail, but failed to make his mark at United because of the competition there. John Doherty, you mentioned earlier on, he makes his debut this season. 5 appearances in the league, 2 goals, inside forward, deputising for Downey, actually. So Doherty showing a lot of capability of stepping up to the mark. One good thing about you always notice of these players, they either there never seemed to be like an in-between. They either came in and failed to score and they were quickly moved out, or they were quite prolific. And Doherty had that about him. For an inside forward, 2 in 5 from his first appearances in the league is very good indeed.
Yes, he was. He was very, very highly rated, but unfortunately, knee injuries always hampered him.
Yeah.
And sorry.
I was just going to move on to Johnny Downey, but please.
Johnny Downey, yes, yep.
Johnny Downey, 4 goals in 23 appearances this season, 3 in the league. So obviously he's a player whose position is fairly at riskier from the likes of Billy Whelan in the youth team. He's inside forwards. United are about to develop a plethora of inside forwards, and much to Busby's delight, but obviously to the chagrin of some of these first team players who served United so admirably over the years. Eddie Lewis is the next name to mention. Eddie Lewis, as Paddy already mentioned in the last episode, a character we'll talk about in future episodes as well, but he's already made his mark here. 9 goals in 14 appearances already. 7 in 10 in the league, 2 in 4 in the FA Cup. So he came in, he had to fill a gap, and he hit the ground running. But because he was 17 and Busby wasn't entirely convinced that he could rely on a young lad like that, and because Lewis was fairly combustible as well, and he needed some calming down a little bit. Obviously, that was why one of the players I'm about to mention got brought in. Harry McShane made 5 appearances. Obviously, he came in basically to succeed the right-sided players who sort of moved on at this point. Then he'd filled it, he'd filled in admirably, he'd done a good job there. But it was time for Johnny Berry to come in and sort of step up now, and he was doing that job now. So McShane, 5 appearances, but mostly helping out with the reserve team and doing quite well, assisting the young lads' development in there. Stan Pearson, top scorer this season, 16 goals in the league, 18 in all appearances, 39 appearances in the league, and 44 in all competitions. Jack Rowley, 11 goals in 26 in the league and 16 in 31 in all competitions. And then you've got David Pegg, who we've already mentioned him a couple of times in this episode, but this was the season where he made his debut. 4 goals in 21 appearances. 19 of those appearances were in the league. Now, Pegg was highly rated from Doncaster. He was starring for England schoolboys, and that Busby had personally intervened again to make sure that he got him, because Pegg again was covered by many clubs. Busby's quote on Pegg was, "It might have helped me in my quest, although I'm not sure about that. If I promised Mr. Pegg," that's David Pegg's father, "that his boy was going to be a world beater. But it's never been United policy to build castles in the air for the benefit of players or their parents." Busby had pragmatically insisted, hadn't he, Paddy, that with reasonable luck, David could make it as a professional.
Yeah. That was. Oh, there was always that caveat, except when he was talking about Duncan Edwards.
Yeah, the one exception, but as we'll come to discover, he's the exception for a reason. Jackie O, Johnny Scott, as Paddy mentioned earlier, one of the many players in this, like Ernie Bond, who was James Bond. They carried a couple of names. Jackie Scott, I went with the forward, just 2 appearances. He made 3 overall, but only 2 in this season. Again, one of these players who came in and, as Busby was trying the different lads from the reserves, he was a wide forward. He was Belfast born, signed as a pro earlier in the season, and he made his debut in that 6-2 loss at Wolves. So it was quite difficult for him to make an impression. And to be fair, maybe a little bit difficult for him in the circumstances as well, with some of those older players struggling as well, because as we've seen, sometimes you need the older players on top form in order to be able to create a good environment for those lads coming in. And that leaves us down to the last 2 players here, Paddy. The first one, Tommy Taylor, £29,999. Quoted by Cardiff, played at Barnsley. One of the great espionage transfer stories, this one, is Busby and Murphy go to a Barnsley cinema the night before they sign him, trying to steal a march on the Cardiff boss, Cyril Spires. Taylor had netted 19 goals in 28 league games, so he's obviously the kind of player that would step into the breach where Lewis had done so admirably. And he was seen as a natural replacement for Rowley in the front line, Paddy. And he was a player that Busby really wanted, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And as you rightly say, there was competition. But they went there, and the transfer record for Sewell, you mentioned it last week, it was sort of early 30,000s. United were willing to pay 30 for Tommy Taylor, which was a bargain looking back at it. But they didn't want to burden him with being a £30,000 player. So Busby, and they were having a chat with the Barnsley directors. Busby handed a £1 note to the lady who was serving the tea and said, "That's for you, dear." And he knocked the £1 off the fee. So Tommy Taylor cost Manchester United £29,999.
We'll see if he's worth every penny and every pound in episodes to come. And the last player, Taylor played 11 games, scored 7 goals, so a really cracking start to his time at Old Trafford. And the last player to make an appearance this season was Dennis, last but not least, certainly, Dennis VIOLLET, now a ladies' man. I shouldn't comment on that first and foremost, because first and foremost, he was a fantastic footballer from Holland.
A bit more than that, but yeah.
3 appearances, 1 goal this season, but he's coming through the ranks. He'd been playing through the reserves and obviously scoring plenty of goals there. Signed as a professional in 1950, so he'd been waiting for his chance. An inside forward, and we talked about those riches that United had in abundance really coming through. And he was almost a perfect replacement for Pearson, really, because
he was
a little bit more of a goal threat owing to his rapid speed and instinct. I mean, more of a playmaker, more of a scorer than Pearson was a playmaker.
Because they could both do both, though. So it's a good comparison, and a player who's going to figure very, very prominently in ensuing episodes.
Yeah, and we talked about the players there who, a lot of them made between 20 and 30 appearances. So this is as close as we can get to, well, as close as what I could get to when I was putting a regular lineup together. It's pretty difficult to do that, but I think this is as close as it came to what you would say was a regular Manchester United team this season. Let's put it out there to start off with. I don't think that this 11 ever played together, and Aston, he's in there because he played 45 appearances. He obviously moved at centre forward at certain points, like he did in the previous seasons. And obviously, by the end of the season, Pegg was in that left-hand side position. So it was BYRNE and Pegg down the left-hand side. It was very much their area of the team where they'd set up. Pearson and Downey would obviously interchange those positions as well. United hadn't changed the colours throughout the entire series, and they haven't done this time either. Red, white, and black at home. And blue, white, and black in the away strip. The United review remains the same as well, with a handshake at the top, and the average home attendance for this season 34,794. The key results, Paddy, all against Wolves, I would say. Really, there was 3-0 at home and the 6-2 away, both defeats. Really, it was like we said, that first Wolves loss that had United in 21st position that maybe sort of said that they needed to make these major changes. But the key result, probably against Wolves, was the Youth Cup result after actually the 7-1. That was the one that people took most notice of this season. United really showing that the future was rosy, and maybe that Busby's boast was right on the money. The previous episode where he said he'd got a couple of $100,000 in reserve. It looked to be quite frightening for first division managers at the moment. So elsewhere in England, as we always wrap up, obviously Arsenal made up for previous disappointment by winning the league this time round, and Blackpool, who'd suffered their own recent FA Cup heartbreak, won the famous Stanley Matthews Cup final against Bolton. That was this summer. And for United, a bit of a transitional moment in Johnny Carey's retirement. Paddy, he'd been sort of looking at coaching for a while, and the opportunity came up to go to Blackburn. So it was at the end of an era, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So he was able to do what Busby had done and go straight from playing into management. He went to Blackburn Rovers. His final match was in the Coronation Cup, and this gives us a little bit of a historical setting, because the Coronation Cup was played at the end of the season. The United's final match in it was when they lost to Busby's boyhood love, Celtic, up in Glasgow. Although Carey did score a wonderful goal on what was to prove his last appearance. So as he bowed out, Queen Elizabeth II came in.
Remarkable. Carey would move on to manage Blackburn, and he would actually make a fair few comments about the Busby Babes in the following years, which may crop up in the process of this series. A United legend, remembered for lifting the cup in '48, but obviously just a fantastic contribution to Manchester United history. Hopefully, we've paid that due respect in this series, and not he went into multiple positions to move into right half, into a competitive midfield in the sort of twilight of his career and deliver a league title. And then, as you mentioned earlier, helped to bring through the character of these young lads. Was a magnificent contribution that perhaps maybe people just refer to him as a captain of the 48 side, but maybe that latter contribution gets overlooked a little. So, if you're watching this video, then please give it a like and subscribe, and join in the conversation in the comment section. If you're listening to the audio podcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a review on the platform you're listening on. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and we're back next time to talk about the next integration.